Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And I wanted to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about some of the work we're doing specifically in the space of smart homes and using technologies in the home to promote healthy aging. So a lot of the work we do would be placed in this framework of precision medicine or precision health, which calls for collecting and analyzing large data collected on the individual's behavior, lifestyle, genetics, and environmental context. With new and advanced technologies, we now have the opportunity to capture information about an individual, not only during a clinical encounter, but more importantly, as they live in their homes and in the communities. And the technologies I'm talking about today focus more on behavior, lifestyle, and the environmental context. So within this era of technologies to measure and understand health behavior and community living, the term behavioral sensing is often used. And behavioral sensing really refers to two different types of technologies that are often used to capture behaviors outside of a clinical setting. Passive monitoring is usually the types of technologies that you don't have to operate as a user for them to actually collect the data. And a lot of the smart home technologies I'm talking about today are passive monitoring tools, and also wearables, whether it's an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or other types of technologies that we wear that actually capture vital signs, physiological parameters, activity levels, and so forth. The goal with these types of technologies, and more broadly with behavioral sensing, is really to objectively, remotely, and continuously measure aspects of patient physiology, behaviors, and symptoms. So we really have new opportunities with advanced technologies to capture behavior and activities of daily living, replace the need for human observers or self-report. We know already that some of the reports, for example, when people report on their sleep quality, that can have a lot of bias, and that's not always accurate data. And we also cannot afford to actually have people who act as observers when people engage in activities of daily living. And it allows us to shift from an episodic to a continuous monitoring. We are assessing people in the real world and not in a laboratory. And also the goal here is not to have a human at the other end to look at the data points in real time, but rather that we develop the right and hopefully efficient algorithms to extract information so we can identify events, trends, and patterns, so that we identify when something is different from what used to be the normal pattern for that individual, or when we think that there may be an adverse event or an emergency. So this could potentially, the use of behavioral sensing, allow us to shift from a more reactive to a more proactive model, and I'll talk about that more when I go over some specific examples. So today I'm talking about smart homes, and the definition very broadly is a residence with embedded technology that facilitates passive monitoring so that we can promote residents' health, safety, well-being, and independence. So here you can see some pictures from smart home deployments we've done for our projects. And in many of these pictures, you can't actually really see the sensors that well. And part of that is because we don't want them to be too visible. But what you see in these pictures are bed sensors that go under the bed sheets and detect respiration, pulse, and restlessness at night. There's motion sensors that detect motion in the home. Door and window sensors that can tell you when a door or a window has been opened, whether it's a refrigerator door or a cupboard or the front door, so that you can have information about how much time was spent in the home versus outside the home, the number of visitors people had, sedentary behavior, and how much time people spend moving around or not moving at all, the number of social interactions that individuals had. Some of our multi-sensors capture also environmental parameters like temperature, luminosity, and humidity. So as we think of older adults ourselves, friends or neighbors who may live alone and try to stay independent at the residence of their choice for as long as possible, we may often wonder if an older adult is safe, if they're experiencing cognitive or functional limitations that may affect their ability to stay independent, whether they're at risk for falling, whether they're isolated. And these challenges are exacerbated for low-income seniors who live alone because they may have even more limited access to supportive services. So the idea here is that because our current system focuses more on a reactive model where a catastrophic event or an emergency occurs and we are trying to deal then with this crisis, that there could be a potential to use data to potentially predict or even prevent the occurrence of such adverse events. For example, in one of our studies, we had a participant who had an average 2 to 3 bathroom visits at night, and then all of a sudden they experienced a significant increase to 10 to 12 bathroom visits at night. And this was one case where this person had a urinary tract infection that was earlier detected and avoided an unnecessary hospitalization. Or similarly, another resident over time showed more social isolation in terms of spending more time in the home, being more sedentary, and reducing the time spent outside the home or having visitors. And again, that was information that was valuable for the activities director in that retirement community to develop a more tailored plan. The advantages of the smart home approach is that many of those technologies are now low cost and commercially available. You don't have to do an extensive and expensive retrofitting of their home, but rather introduce those to different types of residential structures. Also not have to rely on somebody learning new hardware or software to operate them because it facilitates passive monitoring. Once you have the protocol and the platform in place, those technologies can be replaced as more sophisticated sensors become available. And then finally, for the most part, they have some privacy-preserving features as we're not using videos or capturing people's images, although I'll talk about privacy concerns in a minute, and those do still apply even when we collect data that are not necessarily video-related. So we've done different smart home deployments, and I'm going to show you some examples from one where we used door sensors, stove sensors, sensor mats, and motion sensors. So those give us information about people's activities in the home, whether they're leaving their apartment, coming in or out. A sensor mat can detect when somebody is standing or sitting on the couch. A stove sensor can distinguish between preparing a meal versus having left the stove on and moved on. And in this project, we also used 2 sensors that were developed by Shvetak Patel and his team at the University of Washington, called HydroSense and ElectroSense. And those are sensors that basically give you more information about water and electricity consumption. So they give you more granular information as to what water source is being used. So rather than knowing that somebody's in the bathroom, you can tell if they're washing their hands or taking a shower. And similarly with electricity, you can see if somebody has the TV on or they're using kitchen appliances. So in this specific project, we recruited 145 people, ages 79 to 86. Most of our participants were single occupants, although we did have couples as well. And we recruited them all from an independent retirement community. We had them live with the sensors for 12 months. It was an exploratory study, mostly to understand what concerns people may have, and also if they think that they can make use of the data. We actually provided them with a dashboard so they can access that information, as well as printouts for those who didn't have web access, and try to understand if people could find value in this type of monitoring. Overall, people were very accepting of the technologies and had limited privacy concerns, but we really struggled in terms of figuring out a way that would make the information that we generated most useful and actionable to older adults and their families. So in this study, older adults could choose to have a trusted other or family member also participate in the study, and they could also choose if they wanted to for their clinician, usually their primary care provider, to also participate in the study. So then we did some focus groups to try and understand how those different stakeholders would benefit from the data that the systems generate. And as you can imagine, those groups have different purposes and needs when it comes to using the information. So while we tried different prototypes in terms of visualizing the information, it was clear that because of the distinct information needs, not every stakeholder group found the same utility as we approached different visualization approaches. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but rather just to show you that we took different approaches in terms of visualizing the data, in some cases in terms of what a specific sensor generated. In some cases we tried to have different items or objects in the home and try to understand what was going on throughout the day. We tried a blueprint of the home where the active dots kind of show the movement over time. We used density maps, and I'll talk about those in more detail because those ended up being the more clinically useful. And then we also developed some really nice graphs that nobody really appreciated other than our research team, but we thought they looked great. Where the idea here is that you actually look at the data longitudinally and then you can zoom in at the specific day, and then within the day you can get the information that you need. But clearly, there are a lot of challenges with trying to make this data be useful and actionable. A lot of our older adult participants in our study wanted to have an ability to annotate the data and use it more as a diary function, where they could actually take notes and say, that day I stayed at home because I didn't feel well, or that day I was more active because I had a visitor, and didn't necessarily define the information only in the context of clinical utility, but rather in terms of their own life and what was important to them. Similarly, family members often talked about the need to be able to see the information that most directly pertains to safety. So not necessarily having information about when people open a door or how often they open the refrigerator door, but rather only alerts if it looked like, for example, their loved one had not engaged in meal preparation for a day or two. And then finally, clinicians wanted obviously more high-level data, things that would show patterns or trends that would deviate from what would be the expected pattern, and cases where they thought attention needed to be paid. There are, of course, concerns when you have too much data and actually expect somebody to act upon the data. So in trying to understand what types of data may make more sense, I do want to use an example. Yes? Oh, sure. So basically here you see the sensor activity over time. So the x-axis is the whole month. And then you have the 4 different regions, the kitchen, the bathroom, the bedroom, and the living room. One slice of this graph allows you to zoom in into the daily activity for that day. So that graph is now the 24 hours in the day in a circular representation. And what you do see is that the colors match the room. So what you do see is what time of the day was there a firing for a sensor in that room. So for example, you see now that at 1 a.m. there was some motion in the bedroom. Later towards 2 a.m. there were 2 bathroom visits. So basically the line here gives you the time, and then the color indicates the room. But if you find this confusing, you would not be alone. Nobody really liked these graphs, but I like them, so I'm always using them in presentations. And then people always ask, why would you ever design this? But this also explains that the research team itself is a different stakeholder group with very different needs and preferences. The idea was, though, that we were trying to look at a dashboard that's interactive, where you can zoom in and out, or you can choose the day that you want to focus on, recognizing that not everybody wanted to look at the data day by day. And actually most of our participants, especially the clinicians and the family members, didn't need or want to see the data on that granular level, but rather wanted to see the whole graph. And then there was a very significant change, an increase or decrease. They wanted to be able to zoom in and see what happened that day. But here's an example of our density maps that actually ended up being much more useful, and these are real data from one of our participants. So what you see on the left is a density map of a 78-year-old resident in our study. So the density maps actually show you on the x-axis the hours in the day, and the y-axis the days in the month. The colors represent the density of the motion sensor firings. So black means that the person is not in the home. They have left the home and they're outside of the apartment. White means they're inside, but there's no motion. There's no motion sensor firings. And then the whole spectrum from yellow to dark blue indicates the level of motion, with dark blue being the most motion sensor firings, meaning a person that is, for whatever reason, very active and very mobile within the space that the motion sensors capture. So what you see on the x-axis is a person who has a somewhat regular pattern in their daily living. They have a, for the most part, restful night, and usually they wake up around 6 or 7 a.m. There's some motion in the home as they get ready, and then usually you can see the black line around 8, which is the time they leave to go and have breakfast in the common area, in the dining room. They usually then come back, although not always, and have about more than half of the times they do also go out for lunch. They come back, there's some motion, and then they also go out consistently for dinner. On the right side, you can see the density map for the same resident a year later. And what you can see now is that this regularity and this pattern is no longer there. As a matter of fact, a lot of times people now show activity at night. They're more restless. There was one incident where they opened and left the apartment at midnight or close to midnight. In other days, they are skipping breakfast and lunch for the most part. But they are showing up for dinner somewhat regularly. So this is a resident whose vital signs and overall clinical picture based on the community nurse assessment hadn't changed from the previous year. And also there wasn't necessarily alarming behavior because that person was engaging in the dinner activity so the community members could see them. But what was happening actually was that there was a significant change in their behavioral pattern as reflected by this density map. And this was a case with a person who was experiencing some cognitive limitations that were reflected in that behavior. So this is the kind of information that we are hoping to find ways to better visualize when it comes to changes in daily living that may be actionable. We have another one which I didn't include for that participant who showed more social isolation, and you can clearly see that that person is over time taking less time to be outside the home. And we also had a different graph for them that also showed the number of visitors, and that number also declines. So that high-level extraction of behavioral information may in some cases be useful in terms of designing an intervention that's tailored to that individual and may help that person correct or address a pattern that would perhaps be a barrier to aging in place. I'm sorry, do you have a question? So you mean how specific is are the data sets or the? Yes, that's a great question, and for those who didn't hear it, the question was how do you know how sensitive is this information, especially compared to a control group? And I think this actually addresses a very important challenge with smart home research, which I'm talking about later as well, and it has to do with the fact that in many cases the technology is still somewhat innovative, the algorithms are being developed, so a lot of these deployments follow a single group design rather than a randomized control trial. So we often don't have control groups, and we also in many cases use the data retrospectively. So oftentimes we'll know a participant experienced the life event, and then we go back in the data and say, is there something that could have shown us that this person is not doing that great? Which obviously, if we were to fully validate the utility of the sensors, we would need a control group and also to be doing this more proactively, where we could actually then test the ability of the system to identify that abnormality. A lot of the work we're doing now is more exploratory, so we have not really compared it to a control group. And I'm sorry, go ahead. Oh, I'm going to get into that. MCI is mild cognitive impairment. So I'm briefly talking about another project that we also are just started recently, and part of this work is being developed as part of the CDC-funded Pain Injury Science Center. And here we're looking at an intervention, well, an innovation too, but it's really an intervention called Sense for Safety. The idea here is that we could use some of the smart home sensors to help with fall detection. We're specifically targeting older adults with mild cognitive impairment. We know that falls is an issue, and mild cognitive impairment as well as housing conditions are risk factors for multiple falls. And as a matter of fact, cognitive impairment is the leading risk for falls among older adults. Over 60% of older adults with mild cognitive impairment will fall annually 2 to 3 times the rate of those without cognitive impairment. And then similarly, those living in low-resource neighborhoods have twice the risk of falling compared to their counterparts in in communities with better housing conditions. So clearly, there is an opportunity to potentially intervene if we want to keep people safe and also focus not only on fall detection, which in and of itself is important, but also, if possible, at fall prevention. So here we developed an intervention called Sense for Safety that uses depth sensors. And I'll talk a little bit more about depth sensors, but depth sensors are like the Microsoft Kinect tool for any of you who might be familiar with it. It's something that you can put in your home. We place it in the wall at a location that captures the whole area of the room. And it gives you it extracts silhouettes from individual users and provides you with more information that can be useful gait information in terms of steps taken, stride length, and so forth. So you actually have information about how people are moving inside their own home, which we believe is more valuable than the information you sometimes have when you invite people to clinical settings once every 6 months to do a gait assessment test, and you have them walk under artificial conditions on a mat with observers and cameras. So Sense for Safety is an intervention that links at-risk older adults with a nurse telecoach who guides them in implementing evidence-based individual plans to reduce fall risk. So basically, the in-home sensor monitoring provides the nurse with data about the fall risk and the changes in fall risk over time. In addition to that, the nurse communicates with the older adult and their family member about once every 2 weeks to go over the data if there are fall risk changes, but also to talk about specific strategies that are tailored to that individual, whether it's exercises at the level that this older adult could engage in, all environmental adjustments, as well as some problem-solving therapy where people engage in this structured approach to identify what might be specific problems that people are facing when it comes to staying active. Behind the scenes, what the participants don't necessarily get to see or the nurse has to worry about is machine learning that we're employing to inform individualized plans to reduce fall risk. And this is in collaboration with our colleagues at the University of Missouri and March Kubik, who is an engineer there, and has developed machine learning algorithms to extract information from the gait and the silhouette extracted images from the depth sensor. And I'll show you an example to make that a little bit more clear. So in this work, you actually use the depth sensor to understand gait in the home. You could actually capture, because the data are stored in the server and then they can be erased, you can actually capture the silhouette images of the individual. So this is from an actual residence where they had the depth sensor in the wall. Now when you get the advantage of this is that when the nurse gets an alert that the resident has fallen, she actually can use the last seconds of that silhouette extraction video, if you will, to review if this is a true positive or a false positive. So based on the silhouette, you can actually see if the person fell or maybe something else was going on. So before they would start with the protocol of responding to the fall, there is an added layer of double checking, if you will, to make sure that the fall didn't really take place or that it did take place. So this is one of the aspects of the system, and that focuses more on the immediate fall detection, when the system has detected that somebody has fallen and a response is necessary. But we believe that there is also value in understanding how somebody walks in their home and their gait may change so that you can predict the fall risk changes over time. In work that has been done with depth sensors as well as traditional in-clinic gait assessments, people find that actually the parameters of walking speed and stride length, especially if it happens over a short period of time, can be predictors of fall risk changes. A decrease in walking speed of 5.1 centimeters per second over 7 days means, for example, an 86% probability of falling within the next 3 weeks. And similarly, a significant decrease in stride length over a week increases your probability on falling in the next 3 weeks. Now, this is the kind of numeric information that would be very hard for us to actually capture every day in somebody's home. And with the depth sensor, the machine learning algorithm extracts that information and calculates the fall risk. More importantly, identifies the change in fall risks and allows for the nurse coach to work with the older adult and their family to see what may be possible to prevent the fall. Another aspect in the intervention that we do early on is that when the nurse goes out, she goes with a technician to install the depth sensor in the participant's residence. And during that visit, they also conduct an environmental assessment to identify fall risks in the home. As you can imagine, in some cases, minor adjustments like straightening a carpet or fixing something or assessing how people walk in their own home can in some cases also provide a very low-cost way to prevent falls. So that environmental assessment is also useful for the nurse who then later goes over the data with participants every 2 weeks because she has been in the home and has detailed notes. She uses a structured evaluation assessment tool that kind of highlights the fall risk that that individual has in their own home. For example, if they live in a 2-story home, so they actually have to always go up the stairs and down the stairs if they want to use the bathroom. That might be information that is obviously important to know as you strategize in terms of reducing fall risk. Sure.
So I understand that the sensors can capture all of this information, all this data.
Mm-hmm.
How is it actually analyzed? I mean, how is it figured out that the walking speed is decreased or the stride length is changed? Do the sensors provide the information?
Yeah.
How does it get analyzed?
So the sensors provide information about stride length and gait characteristics. There's about, I think, 11 or 12 variables related to gait assessment that are calculated, they're computed by the silhouette extraction. Once you have those, they all go into a formula that calculates fall risk. And so this formula of fall risk is based on existing clinical assessment as well as refined algorithms through previous work with the sensor technologies. So the fall risk would be, and I'm making this formula up, but let's say change in stride length over time plus change in gait, in walking speed over time divided by what is the average for that population and so forth. So this is an algorithm that has been validated both in a clinical laboratory setting as well as in the community in other studies, not by us. And the algorithm performs, in the most recent study they've done, the algorithm was performing as good as, or in some cases better than, the gait experts who did the in-person assessment. The goal is here to keep refining it so that it would perform even better. What has not been tested, and we hope our intervention may address that in addition to actually also having the coaching component, is it has only been tested with cognitively intact older adults, so this would be the first deployment with people with mild cognitive impairment.
On the other hand, if you've got, as you say there, 51% probability,
Mm-hmm.
is that based on recording 10 falls in your population or 2,000 falls? So the confidence of that figure, is it plus or minus 20% or what? With me?
You mean?
I don't know how big, when you say you're going to estimate the probability of falling in the next 3 weeks,
Mm-hmm.
if I was told that I got that probability, I'd really like to know how big the study was on which that statistic is based.
Yeah.
And what I'm asking is that in the study that they published, Phillips, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
did they have a population which recorded 10 falls or 100 falls? Because it seems to me, you know, building that population is very difficult.
Yeah. So the calculations in terms of the algorithm were not done with using the sensor technologies, but rather people coming into the lab to do the gait assessment. There is a software that's often used by rehabilitation experts called Gait Ride, and what they do is they ask you to walk up and down, and so they measure your gait characteristics. So there is a database that records falls, but it is not a perfect one because the capturing of the events in that cohort sometimes is self-report. Like people will say, yes, I experienced a near fall or I experienced a fall. In this specific sample, I don't remember the number, but it's a large sample of people, but it's all based on observation and gait assessment by rehabilitation experts. So I think it was in the hundreds, but I don't know how big their sample was. The problem with a lot of the fall detection literature is that you try to capture a near fall, which is when the person did not end up in an actual fall, but was about to fall. And then a real fall, and then within the falls there's what's called the long lie, when people are on the floor undetected for a while. And it's been found that when people are asked to recall and report those events, there is not always the most accurate reporting because you have to rely on your own recollection and near falls that are important because not every gait issue is an actual fall, but near falls are often significantly underreported. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this population, mild cognitive impairment, has almost double the likelihood of falls compared to cognitively intact older adults in the community. And then there are different reports that show the likelihood of a fall for different age groups. For example, people who are between 75 and 85, 85 and 95. And depending on the community setting they're in, if they're independent in a retirement community or assisted living facility. A lot of these numbers are usually based on average, based on numbers of all reported. And then, like I said earlier, there is often this concern in the literature that those numbers might be underreported because in order for a discrete event to get recorded, you usually have to have had some type of response, whereas a lot of falls don't have that. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Because if you backward chain from what you could do, then when you detect an outlier, so to speak, then you could intervene, but there might be many things that we can't practice. And similarly for wandering, I imagine would be a really big useful application. Presumably there are many things you could do as well in terms of detection of any question. What can you intervene with that?
Yeah. That's a great question, and I think the actual intervention is something that we're really interested in terms of how could the nurse coach actually effectively provide tailored interventions or recommendations besides the here's a few exercises to do. And so what we hope to find out, because we haven't actually started the study, we got the CDC funding just this summer, and so we're still doing pilots, but what we hope to do when we deploy long-term in people's homes is to let the data guide us as to some of the interventions. For example, we know that with cognitively intact older adults, most of the falls happen at night during a bathroom visit. If that is the case here as well, there are some relatively low-cost approaches to addressing that. For example, working with the nurse coach to figure out if it would be possible to work on lighting, or to turn on the light in the bathroom, or I know there's more sophisticated solutions like sensor mats that detect you're getting out of bed and so the lights turn on automatically. when you have a better understanding of the path that somebody's taking in the home, you can have the technician who goes into the home ensure that that path is clear of specific barriers or threats to or things that could cause a fall. I know in the literature sometimes people are kind of hesitant to make a lot of environmental or home-based changes in terms of the infrastructure or even the shoes they wear. But depending on what the data tell you, there might be, in addition to exercises, things to do to either address the likelihood of a fall and reduce it, or to have the significant other or family member play a more active role, especially if there was a case where the fall risk is significantly increased. Perhaps there needs to be a plan in place to ensure safety. Maybe somebody has to move in or something needs to be adjusted at a significant rate compared to more minor modifications. The advantage of having the nurse coach interact with people over time would be that hopefully this would be an ongoing formative process, so that rather than waiting as we do now for the fall to occur and then figuring out what to do, this could be a stepwise or gradual process of maximizing safety in the home. So this is an example of what the what the dashboard looks like for the nurse coach. And here you can see that you have information like the stride length, average speed, stride time, and then you get those gait alerts. But also there's fall alerts. And the fall alerts is something that we have to really work on in terms of ensuring that we have a solid plan in place to address false positives and false negatives. So when there is an actual fall alert, the nurse coach can always go back and review the last few seconds of the silhouette extracted sequence to confirm that this is a fall. But even so, we do anticipate, especially based on work that they've done with the depth sensors in Missouri, that there might be some false positives that you cannot easily eliminate completely. So making sure that those are not becoming burdensome to our participants is a priority, especially when people want to stay active and you don't want to constantly remind them that they're at risk for falling or that somebody's monitoring them to ensure that they don't fall. So one of the things that we have been dealing with these technologies is this notion of obtrusiveness. Many times in the smart home literature, people will say, well, those technologies are not obtrusive because you don't have to train anybody to use them, so they just happen in the background. But that's obviously not the full definition of obtrusiveness. Obtrusiveness is much more complex because it's a summary evaluation by the user in terms of which characteristics of the technology are physically or prominent or psychologically prominent and undesirable to them. So a technology may be perceived as obtrusive not only in terms of how hard or easy it may be to operate, but what it does to one's privacy or self-identity when you introduce the technologies in the home. And I think this is an important aspect to consider as we think about turning our residential infrastructure into a monitoring unit. We had developed a while back an obtrusiveness framework that had a lot of different parameters that basically were used for us to guide us in understanding people's acceptance and perceptions. And one of the things that here becomes important is to also understand what people think of the technology, if they fully understand what is being monitored and why, who they're sharing the data with, and for what purpose. And actually, I always tell a story. We had many years ago in a smart home project where we used these motion sensors, and we had a resident, and part of our exit interview was to ask people about privacy. Did you feel bad for having the sensors? Did visitors ask you about it? How did you feel? We did a very detailed consent visit where we explained what the sensors were. So we had this one participant where we asked at the end if they had any privacy concerns, and this gentleman said, no, I don't have any privacy concerns, and I don't mind that I have the motion sensors in my home. And when I get dressed in the morning, I just try to do that in the shower behind the curtain. And that was because, as we found out, he really thought that the motion sensors had a video camera attached to them. But that tells us that even when we think that we're doing this whole consent process and trying to explain what we're capturing, we really have to do a better job at making sure that people fully understand what the data means. In this case, it didn't affect their decision to participate, but it clearly affected their daily living. As a matter of fact, we may have increased his risk for falling as he was trying to get dressed in the shower. So there's a lot of dimensions to obtrusiveness. It has to do with the physical aspects of technology. For example, some of the older smart home systems used to have cables hanging from the ceiling before we got the more advanced wireless sensors. So going into a home where you have to adjust your home to accommodate for this new physical artifact, it can be, in many cases, undesirable. There's usability issues even with passive monitoring, because even though you don't operate the sensors and they work in the background by themselves, you still have a dashboard, an interface, a website that somebody, maybe not the older adult, but maybe their family member or a clinician, is reviewing to access that data. So there's still an issue of accessibility for that interface. Privacy is very important, and as I mentioned in this example, it's not only the physical privacy, but also the informational privacy. It's not only do we use encrypted servers, do we use the cloud, but it's also what are the privacy perceptions that people have? Do they fully understand who might get into the data and who cannot get into the data? There's issues around the function of the equipment. Many times we have participants who say, I hear this buzzing noise and I think it's from one of the sensors, which we don't think is the case, but it's still a perception of what the technology may mean. A lot of participants talk about the impact of those technologies on human interaction. Many participants in smart home projects ask if that means that they'll get fewer visits by relatives because they can check on the website how they're doing, or will they get fewer visits by the community nurse because they are being monitored remotely. There is a whole aspect of the self concept and how you identify yourself and how you're perceived by others. Interestingly enough, in a lot of our studies, participants are willing to participate only if their neighbors will participate, because there is still perhaps a potential stigma of having the technologies only in your unit, and you may be the one identified as more frail or in need of monitoring. There's questions around how you may have to adjust your daily routine for some technologies to work. And a lot of people talk about sustainability. Right now, the participants we have in our studies are signing up because it's a research study, and usually it's funded by federal or other funds. But a lot of people talk about the concern if they learn to rely on a system that they may not be able to afford financially or for other reasons in the future. So with this whole big data, wearables, passive monitoring, we have new opportunities for behavioral sensing. We have vast amounts of data that give us information about what's going on with people's lives. So we have an opportunity to harvest the health and healthcare data from all those different sources, structure and integrate them, and then develop the right diagnostic and forecasting models for predicting and detecting health trends. And I think that is a challenge as we try to refine these algorithms and make more sense of the data. And then finally, it's about using the data not only to monitor people remotely, but hopefully to facilitate more shared decision making. How can older adults themselves make use of the information in a way that is meaningful to them? In our study, we actually had the older adults decide who else might have access to the data, whether it would be the family members and or the clinicians. And also they determined the frequency with which they would have access, as well as whether they would have access about all rooms in the home or just one room. And so tailoring the privacy preferences to accommodate individual needs is important. That can be in conflict with cases where you want to monitor a loved one and the loved one doesn't have the cognitive capacity to consent. And I'll talk about this briefly. It is an ethical concern when we think about monitoring technologies. So there are a lot of considerations as we think about new technologies in the home. There is always a concern whether we're actually exacerbating rather than reducing health disparities. In other words, are we really creating tools for people who already have access to different types of healthcare services, and people who don't already have access to services may be further deprived of additional services because of the need for technology infrastructure that may not be necessarily available everywhere. There is a challenge with patient education, and this is not only in the example I mentioned with the gentleman with the camera, and it's not only for research purposes. It's not just the consent process trying to fully understand what is going on with the data and the technology, but how do we address different levels of health literacy, data literacy? People have different varying degrees of familiarity with what the cloud is, what the sensors do. So how do we educate people so that they can freely make an informed decision as to how often they want to be monitored, and what are the patient and the family preferences? Using smart home data does change the process of healthcare delivery, so there is a lot of concerns about new patient-generated data, whether those should be part of an electronic medical record, who would be held accountable if there's information in the data that was not reviewed or addressed, and what would that mean for clinicians and their workflow if we actually were to integrate behavioral sensing data into the formal systems of care. The ethical implications I briefly touched upon, in addition to privacy, have to do with cases in smart homes where the people that are being monitored are not the ones making the decision about the monitoring. This isn't so much in our work where we've recruited community dwelling older adults, but there are a lot of projects where the smart homes are used by distant caregivers for people with dementia or others who don't make the decision to participate themselves, but rather their decisional authority is with the power of attorney, who is usually the family member who decides to have that system installed in the residence. So how do you reconcile perhaps different preferences that the individual may have versus the family member who wants to keep them safe in terms of how often and frequently you may be monitoring people and how intrusive that monitoring may be? And then finally, I do think that this new era of patient-generated data, and more specifically behavioral sensing, does have implications for clinician education. We already see how patients are trying to make sense of their Fitbit data or their Apple Watch data. And as we think about more sensors in the home, there are opportunities for clinicians to make sense of those data analytics and be more informed about how to deal with data, and also generate new knowledge that we didn't have before. For example, when you think about sleep quality, in the past we would ask people how well they think they're sleeping, and there would be some self-report. People would say, I think I'm sleeping fine, or I'm not. And when you needed quantifiable information, you had to have people go into a sleep center to do a sleep study and spend there overnight. Now, we do have a lot of new devices, and not all of them really measure sleep quality, even if they say they do, but there are wearables and other consumer technologies that give you more information. So we might want to think about new algorithms that take into consideration data that we didn't have available before. So it's not exactly that the clinician would become our personal health data scientist, but rather that we need to prepare clinicians to be intelligent consumers of data analytics so that they can make sense of this new type of patient-generated data, and more specifically behavioral sensing. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any additional questions. Mm-hmm.
Who's there? Are you sitting in a control room, or how frequently you analyze the data?
Yes. So what we do, especially in the smart home study, we deploy sensors that are X10 sensors. So they're basically, there is a server in the home that collects all the data, and then they send them to the cloud. We actually have a data quality control check-in where we see if the sensors are working, if we're collecting data, about once a week. We run those algorithms once a week as well, but we have students who are working on trying to refine the algorithms and make more sense of the data. The reason we want to have a more hands-on approach is because sometimes let's say a sensor fell off the wall. And so when we see that we're not getting any more data, we have to go back in and reinstall or make sure that everything is okay. So we actually do have somebody who goes in and just checks that we're getting data streams on a daily basis. But then in terms of doing analysis of the data, we do that on a weekly basis. We have a group that looks at visualizing the data and using R to do more sophisticated things with the visualization. And I don't have any technical expertise in visualization. I only tell people, I think this color is pretty, change that to a circle, which is why the prototypes we create, nobody likes them but me. But they do all the more sophisticated things with the data, so they actually download them from the server to another server to run some of the visualization algorithms that would be separate from the extraction features and making inferences about activities of daily living. We had early on developed kind of like a set of rules as to what activity would be identified through specific sensor firings. So we have a profile for meal preparation, or when somebody's at bed, how do we define restlessness at night? Similarly, when people engage in hygiene, and some of them are very simplistic, like if you're going to the bathroom, you're using the bathroom kind of thing, or if you're in the kitchen and you're using the stove or opening the refrigerator and the cupboard, you are preparing a meal. What we found out is that that is obviously not always the case. There are a lot of people who open the refrigerator door just to look at the refrigerator door and then they close it. So there is a challenge in refining our algorithms and trying to see how accurate those inferences are. Go ahead.
How much of this information can be obtained with an iWatch?
I think a lot of this information could be obtained with the iWatch when it comes to activity levels, like how active you are, how many steps you've taken. You don't really need motion sensors to get that. You might also get more accurate information if you're interested in steps taken or calories burned. The information right now that you wouldn't necessarily get from a wearable would be things around other activities of daily living, like how much time are you spending in a specific room, or how many visitors you have. The information, for example, that you have a restless night, you can get that from your watch, but the fact that you were in the bathroom 3 times and 2 times you got a snack from the kitchen is what the home sensors would add.
Could correlate it with other things that the iWatch tell you.
Yes.
Cardiac arrhythmias and things like that.
Absolutely. And actually, I do think in the future, those technologies, there will be no fine line. The reason why we stayed away from wearables was because early on in the smart home literature, there was this focus on the passive monitoring in the home, and a lot of funding agencies wanted to stay away from wearables. But that has clearly changed. But I think in earlier days of this work, people would say, well, older adults are not wearing their life alerts because there is a stigma, and so people don't like wearables. That has changed because now wearables are not a medical device you put on your neck, but rather it's your watch. It's not age-specific. Young people, old people, everybody has an Apple Watch or an iWatch. So there is, I think, more to be gained from using multiple data sources, both what's going on in the home and something like a wearable. The other advantage of a wearable is that we know in the smart home when somebody has left the apartment, but we don't know what's going on once they left the home. They could be opening the door and staying outside for 3 hours. That doesn't mean they're really active. Whereas having a wearable would give you that information that captures a much broader spectrum. Also for community dwelling people who are independent in the community, there is this notion of life space, which tells you how much you're moving around from the center of your home into your community or traveling further away. And there's all this hypothesis that as your life space shrinks, your independence is reduced. This is all information that you couldn't possibly measure with just smart home technologies because you're limited to the residential infrastructure. Yeah, I think there is great potential there. And actually, there are a lot of people who are now reconceptualizing the notion of the bed and having a smart bed, which is a little bit scary if you think about your bed being more like an ICU bed. But the idea is that there's a lot we can capture, not just with restlessness and pulse and respiration, but also with breathing sounds and combine it with wearables to get more information that could potentially lead to preventing events like a stroke. I've seen some of that work also with using your smartphone. So there's a big push now to find alternative ways to capture vital signs, let's say your blood pressure and so forth, through tools that we already use in our daily living. And I know at the University of Washington they had a system where they were trying to do spirometry with your iPhone. So you would just attach a little thing to your iPhone and blow air into that mouthpiece, which is quite an advancement compared to more traditional ways of spirometry where you had to either have a portable unit or go to the hospital to do this test. So I think we will have more opportunities to measure things that we traditionally had not measured in the home. In the work we are doing, we have focused more on activities of daily living rather than the physiological side of things, but I think these worlds will merge as more technologies become available. Go ahead.
I have two questions. One is on probability scale. I'm doing is the change probability. What was it before the gate change? What was it before the walk feature? Is that really a measure of divided 85% before they took that, or divided 82% before? Second question, different. There's a large home monitoring industry now. They're part of the future, and your work will translate into the monitoring industry.
You know, I think there will definitely that will happen. A lot of the vendors who had been focusing on home telecare and creating portable solutions for pulse oximetry and blood pressure cuffs and so forth are now looking at home monitoring that also captures some of the behavioral side of things, not just vital signs. So I think that will definitely, there will be an intersection between the smart home world and the home monitoring world. And a lot of the smart home systems may have potential for one group of patients or residents who have a certain diagnosis or comorbidities that other groups may not necessarily benefit from. So I think we might see more solutions that have integrated home monitoring devices and smart homes as one package for, let's say, people with CHF and COPD or different types of patient groups. And then in terms of your first question, the change in probability, the baseline, in the sensitivity analysis, that decrease in the walking speed was the one that led to an increase in the probability. So this is an 86% increased probability. Yes. Yes, sorry, I should have been more clear. So let's say the likelihood was prior or before the walking speed change was detected was the fall risk is usually a single digit, or it's something like 2.3 or 3.1, the way they calculate it. So their fall risk score saw an increase of 86%. Okay.
Your talk was devoid to a great extent in terms of economics or cost. And if you look in healthcare as a whole, the government is putting brakes on a lot of emerging technology. Tremendous amount of brakes are being put on the financing or government underwriting of genomics, where the application of genomics, shall we say, in preventing inappropriate statins, etc., is there in the press, but it's no longer funded. Now then, if you've got a private industry or growing industry that's seeing the potential of these monitors, but could you prognosticate and say whether you think this is going to have wide application underwritten by the government, or is it going to be something which is only likely to be available to the affluent population?
I'm afraid it will be more the latter in the immediate or more short term, because already there's a lot of interest by retirement communities and different types of assisted living facilities to use smart home technologies. So a lot of the more commercially available solutions are specifically targeting the communities that provide services to an upper socioeconomic status. A lot of retirement communities are looking at this. There are some efforts in dementia care to look at sensor work to keep people safe in memory care units, for example. But I think until we have more solid evidence and until we have randomized clinical trials that would show things like reduction of hospitalizations, I don't think CMS or any of the federally related funding sources would ever consider providing reimbursement. What might in the future though become more likely is if these sensors are proven to reduce certain types of health events for specific populations, maybe in rehabilitation care or dementia care, they might become part of a home telecare toolkit. But I don't see them right now becoming something that the government would provide reimbursement for.
Thank you all, and thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you.
Fascinating and
Thank you so much.
informative, and just help you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.